Hey everyone, it's Roland here and I'll be doing a breakdown of the deck that I used to place 9th at the recent Oceania International Championship. Firstly, just a quick recap of my tournament run. I started day 1 5-0-4, finishing at seed 13 at the end of day 1. On day 2 I went 3-1-1, finishing 9th on a record of 29 points, just shy of top 8, with a record of 8-1-5. So I didn't bubble in the traditional sense, so yeah, did finish 1 point below top 8, so can't be too mad about that. And yeah, I just thought the tournament overall was a really fun experience. It was my first time playing in quite a while. It was my first event of the season, so you know, I was initially a bit nervy sort of getting back into it, but yeah, I think really enjoyed myself. Met lots of cool people, and yeah, played some really interesting games. So yeah, without further ado, let's get to the list. What's it all about? Most people have probably heard of the deck by now, but probably don't know exactly what it entails. So the first thing that we should talk about is that it's not a mill deck. So Hoopa is a card that's traditionally associated with mill, but in this list, we want to be attacking with it, and crucially, we want to be attacking with it over and over and over again. Even say Hoopa Wobbuffet lists, which are ultimately a mill deck, you know, that they'll typically play a few counter energy, which they might use to attack some various attackers, often not Hoopa. But this list, you actually want to attack with Hoopa consistently. And why we want to do that is we want to knock out our opponent's non-EX and non-GX Pokemon that can get around Hoopa's Scoundrel Guard ability. You know, this is essentially the ability that makes the entire deck tick. It's really what makes the deck work, because otherwise it's a pretty uninspiring card. 120 HP is not bad for a basic, but Super Cybolt is not exactly going to set the world on fire, but it is good enough to typically 2-hit KO, and often 1-hit KO, some Pokemon that can actually deal with Hoopa, essentially, that aren't EXs and GXs. So we want to grind our opponent down, and typically decks will have a few attackers that they can use to KO Hoopa, but once you get rid of those, you can essentially just steamroll your way to victory, and you know, you can essentially take 6 prizes. It's not a deck that's trying to race to 6 prizes, so you are attacking, and you want to attack every turn, ideally, although often there'll be turns where you pass because attacks that you do won't be relevant. I'll get into that later, most likely, but you know, you're not trying to race your way to 6 prizes. Really, you're not under any rush to take prizes. It's the knockouts that are important. It's running your opponent out of resources and the attackers that they can use to deal with Hoopa, and then essentially, you know, you could take 15 prizes unopposed. You know, you're not racing to prizes. You know, you're just kind of grinding out a winner, essentially. The next thing to notice is that it's not a quad Hoopa deck. There are some supporting plays here, so not just for Hoopa. I think it's been described by some people as a quad Hoopa deck. It isn't that, technically. So we have Oranguru, is I think the first card that we should note that isn't Hoopa. And Oranguru is really good, particularly end-proofing you. So this is a deck that can potentially lose games that otherwise shouldn't if you get end to just a few cards later on in the game. And Oranguru can draw you a few cards early on, because we do, as you see in the rest of the list, as we'll get to it, this list has quite a few burnable cards. So often, even early on, you can get, you know, draw at least 1 or 2, maybe even 3 cards out of Instruct. It's not just for the late game. Additionally, Oranguru has an attack, which is situational, but can be useful, particularly against opposing Orangurus. Because Oranguru is actually one of the main Pokemon that can one-hit KO Hoopa. So against decks like Fikabulu that play it, and even say Volcanion, if they Field Blow away fighting Fury Belt, or if you don't have one, Psychic does just enough damage to KO Hoopa that's fully powered up, and we can respond to them with an Oranguru of our own to get a one-hit KO, and ideally sort of set up a more favourable trade than just attacking into an Oranguru twice with Hoopa, because they'll get another knockout in the Hoopa. You don't always want to do this, and that trade isn't as favourable as it might seem. It might be hard going into the details here, but you want to be quite judicious of when you attack with these secondary attackers. It might seem like a no-brainer, like, oh, well, I can get a one-hit knockout, whereas with Hoopa I wouldn't be. But often, the way the trades work out, it's not 100% unambiguously more favourable. You always want to be attacking with Hoopa when you can, but sometimes Oranguru, it's optimal to attack with. And I guess our next attacker that we can use is Tapu Koko. So this is actually a relatively niche card in this deck. We're not going to use it to attack too often. It does have Free Retreat, which is nice. Excuse me. But Flying Flip is only going to be useful in a handful of matchups. The main one that I put it in for is Garbodor. So that's, of course, one of the ways that decks can get around Hoopa Scoundrel Guard. And so Buzzwole Garbodor wasn't actually hugely popular at the event, but it does seem to be gaining a steady rise in popularity, and also Glispo Garbodor's around, didn't really see much on the day. But essentially, the idea here is that you'd aim to hit Garbodors and Trubishes on the bench, all for 20, so then you can Guzma up a Garbodor and knock it out with Super Cybolt. And crucially, what it allows you to do as well is it allows you to put Trash Avalanche Garbodor in 1-hit KO range. Excuse me, I still have the remnants of a cold. But what it allows you to do is set up a Trash Avalanche Garbodor for a knockout, because of course it has 120 HP, even with the Fighting Fury Belt, and what do we see here, and a Reverse Valley. That's still not going to be enough. But if we put 20 damage on it from Flying Flip, we can get sort of a quasi 1-hit KO on it. And also, the crucial thing here that makes it easier is that typically these Garb decks, in order to attack with Garbodor, actually need to play Rainbow Energy. Some Garb decks, say like the Espeon Garbodor variant, which actually won in the senior division, so good job to him. Some of them play, well obviously those decks will play basic Psychic, so they won't take the 10 damage, so then you'll still need to do 100 damage after one Flying Flip. But it's relatively easy to do just 90 damage, because you just need a Fighting Fury Belt or a Reverse Valley. So I think Tapu Koko is pretty crucial in being able to, in those matchups. Unfortunately, it is weak to fighting, so you still are going to be under a lot of pressure by Buzzwole. I'll get to that. I'll get to that when we get to the matchup section. But essentially, this gives you a fighting chance in Garb matchups, particularly when paired with 4 Guzma, which we'll get to a bit later. The last Pokemon we have is good old Giratina. You can probably guess what this is for, and that's none other than everyone's favorite deck, Greninja. Without this, Greninja's a very poor matchup. It's essentially unwinnable. With this, it's definitely a favorable matchup. I didn't play against any Greninjas on either day, but yeah, I think it's worth playing, just because you can turn what's essentially an auto loss into something that's very strong. Also, it can be useful just to stall for a bit because it has fighting resistance. So I was talking about Buzzwole Garb earlier, putting you under a lot of pressure. This can be used to stall while you build Hoopas on the bench, so that you can get a Guzma KO on a Garbotoxin Garbodor. Because even though you theoretically might have all the cards to deal with their Garbodor cards, Buzzwole is such a fast and potent attacker when you have fighting weakness that you might not have time to set up these cards. And they only play 3 Guzma, typically, and because they have Garbotoxin in play, they can't use Tapu Lele, so they're not always going to be able to Guzma around Giratina, and they really don't want to be using like Knuckle Impact or anything like that just to carry this. Well, often they won't have the energy to do it. So this can be useful as a stall card in that matchup. But yeah, look, I think other than that, it's pretty much dead weight, and you generally don't want to start with it. But it is a bit of a tank, 130 HP. So look, with all of these cards, they're not the absolute worst if you do start with them, even in matchups where you don't play them, just because they are relatively tanky. Okay, so onto like the trainer engine. Most of this stuff's pretty standard. We have 4 Professor Sycamore. This is a pretty standard card. There's no reason you wouldn't want to play this. Typically, we can pitch most of our cards and get rid of them. It's typically not the end of the world. Sometimes you'll have some bad discards like Super Rods and maybe too many other supporters, things like that. But this is a deck that you definitely want to be playing for. You really need that draw power to keep up and just keep streaming Hoopas over and over again. We have 4 N, so again, the format currently, at least until Cynthia comes out, well, which is already, I suppose, by the time this is uploaded, we don't really have a lot of great shuffle draw, so N's really a no-brainer. I mean, I think the disruption potential of N isn't as useful in this deck. It can be helpful in a pinch, but typically, you'd rather trade drawing more cards for yourself and giving your opponent more cards. Generally, it's more important that you draw the cards that you need. I think one way that you can lose matchups that you otherwise shouldn't, as I alluded to earlier, is if you get into a low hand size and you can't draw things. Well, and that can apply to your own ends even, if you're forced to play them with no other draw support. So, look, N's a good card, obviously, and drawing Shuffle Draw 6 is good, and we need Shuffle Draw in this sort of deck. But, I think, maybe even say with Cynthia coming out, if you were to play the deck going forward, I think I'll touch on whether that's a good idea later on. But, N, it's a good card, but it can be a bit sort of counterproductive. We also have 2 Lily, which is really nice draw supporter. It's really kind of like the 3rd draw supporter in the format. The decks play when they feel like they don't have enough draw, and yeah, it's really good. And going first, you can draw up to 8, so it's quite a powerful draw card. And yeah, it's just solid. And because, as I mentioned before with Oranguru, this deck can pitch a lot of its cards, so typically you are going to be drawing quite a few cards, and it's generally unlikely that you get stuck with a hand that's too large and with cards that you can't play. And that you can't Lily. Generally, that's unlikely, I would say. And now onto this power supporters. So we have 4 Guzma, and this is really crucial because we want to target down specific Pokemon. Of course, there's non-EX and GX Pokemon. You know, we don't want to hit GX Pokemon over and over again because we're not really interested in racing to prizes. Say we're playing a Boswell Lycanroc deck and they're powering up a Rockruff or something like that on the bench, and they've just, you know, stalling with a Buzzwole active. Well, we don't really want to hit that. You know, what's that damage doing? It's not doing a lot to us. What we want to do ideally is Guzma up the threat on the bench and take a knockout on that. Guzma's also useful as a switching card for your own purposes, of course. That's a use for it. And yeah, and just with the low damage output of Super Cybolt, Guzma gives us a bit of power, and it means that we're not hitting into things that aren't relevant, that aren't going to help us win. So I think, yeah, 4 Guzma in this deck really is a no-brainer, and yeah, it's a very important card in the deck. And sometimes you can't play Guzma because, of course, you can't switch and then still attack. You can't switch your own Pokemon and still attack. But to mitigate that, we have, well, in addition to Tapu Koko, which you can use in a pinch, you can also, well, if you draw it, we play 3 Floatstone. So, yeah, it's a very, very important card. The last supporter I want to talk about is Acerola. So, Acerola functions as a healing card and lets us pick up our energy. And it's good against decks that can do consistent damage to Hoopa but might not be able to get a 1-hit KO. And I think it's crucial in swinging certain matchups. So I think particularly things like Vikabulu, if you can stick Fighting Fury Belts, they really don't have anything in their deck that can do 160 damage to a Hoopa. So you can really get some mileage out of Acerola. This isn't a deck that can spam Acerola in the same way that the mill decks can, purely because you're losing 2 energy, at least, either Dark DC or 3 Dark, every time you use Acerola. So it's not something you can play over and over again, because you'll just, if you do it too much, obviously you'll just have to pass, because you can't attach all the energy right away again. So obviously it's not a card that you can abuse, but as a 2 of, it's good in some matchups. Some matchups you won't really play it much, because when you do get attacked, you'll be getting 1-hit KO'd. So, you know, it's more for those sort of closer matchups where excuse me, you'll be getting like 2-hit KO'd by attackers that can't get 1-hit KOs, and it can swing them in your favor essentially. It could also sort of function as a switching card if decks try and Guzma stall Hoopas with like no energy on the bench. It can function as a switching card, and if they're damaging it, it can function as a switching card in that sense. So, you know, I think it's a solid card. I wouldn't play more than 2 just because, yeah, you can't actually play that many in a game. But yeah, I think it's an important card. As for the rest of the trainers, so we should probably get into the energy line, because of course that's probably the main thing that differentiates this from the other Hoopa Mill decks, and that's all the energy that we play. So we want to be attacking as fast as possible, and we want to be able to stream Hoopas over and over again. So we've got 9 Darkness energy and 4 Double Colorless energy. I originally played 10 in my list. I had to cut it down to 9 by playing 2 Super Rod. Decks with 4 Max Elixir want to be playing as many energy as possible. I mean, I think we all know that terrible sensation of, you know, whiffing several Max Elixirs in a row, and it's really painful. So, you know, you could definitely put another energy in this. I'll get to that when I talk about alternative plays you can make for this deck. But yeah, so you want to be essentially, ideally you want to be attaching a Dark and a DC at every Hoopa. You can also have power up Hoopas with 3 Dark energy. That's something that you can do. It's something that you'll sometimes have to do. And the dilemma that you get with this deck quite often is knowing what energy to attack where, because to attach where, because you can either power up a Hoopa, yeah, with 3 Dark or 1 Dark and a Double Colorless. So sometimes you'll face a dilemma. So say, for instance, you've got a Hoopa on the bench with a Dark already, and say you're just Max Elixiring, and you hit a Dark, and you're wondering, okay, do I put the Dark on a second Hoopa that I have on the bench with no energy, or do I put it on the Hoopa on the bench that already has a Dark energy? If I put it on the Hoopa that already has a Dark energy, and then I draw, you know, cards, so I'm about to play Professor Sycamore, and I don't draw a Dark energy, I've essentially wasted that energy. So say I draw a DCE, in order to attack with the Hoopa that has 2 Dark on it, well, I'll have to attach a Double Color, so I've essentially wasted a Dark. But then conversely, if I put the Dark in the Hoopa with no energy, and then say Sycamore, and all I draw is Dark energy, well, now I can't attack, because now I've just got 2 Hoopas with Dark energy each. So sometimes you have to weigh up what's more important, me making every energy count, or me just attacking right now. So sometimes that's a bit of a dilemma this faces, which sort of you don't really see in many other decks, that you can power things up with kind of like multiple amounts of energy. We have a special charge, which really helps with that as well. So, I mean, theoretically, you can have 6 DCE, but keep in mind also that many decks will play Enhanced Hammer and get rid of it. So often you'll have no choice but to power up with 3 Dark. And yeah, in terms of energy recovery, we have 2 Super Rod. This allows us to get, well, essentially as many Hoopas as they can knock out in a game. Typically, you won't be able to power up 6 Hoopas. That's generally unlikely, but it's something that you can do. And Super Odd, essentially allows us to, have as many as we want. And it means if we did have to discard one Super Odd, it's not the end of the world. And shuffling back in more Dark, as I mentioned before, makes Max Elixir more potent. So yeah, essentially, we're trying to stream Hoopas and run our opponent of attackers that can KO us. In terms of, okay, so some of the more basic cards, we've got 4 Nest Ball. This is a no-brainer in the deck. It gets us all our basics. We don't have to pay a cost for it like Ultra Ball. We want our basics out as soon as possible. We want to get out Hoopas on the bench that we can Max Elixir to, even if we're not immediately attacking with them right now. It's very important that we do that. We have 2 Ultra Ball. This is just because we need more search. So obviously Nest Ball's well, almost always, not always, but almost always a better search card than Ultra Ball in this deck. But we need more search essentially, because you don't want to say start off with a Giratina or start off with an Oranguru and you just can't draw any search cards. That would be that's quite a bad situation, definitely. And you want to increase your consistency and make sure that you're getting as many basics as you can. Ultra Ball can also thin cards out of your hand to use Instruct with Oranguru and to even use Lily, and it can also get useless attackers out of your deck. So, sorry, useless Pokemon out of your deck. Say, for instance, a matchup with Giratina isn't useful. You can Ultra Ball for it before you're playing to Professor Sycamore. So, yeah, look, it's a very, I think I wouldn't play less than 2 Ultra Ball. I think just to be on the safe side. Yeah, I think six search cards is pretty necessary, I would say. I wouldn't feel comfortable with much less. So, yeah, alluded to this earlier, but Fighting Fury Belt really is the tool of choice in this deck. The only thing that you might otherwise consider is Choice Band, but that extra 40 HP is very crucial. We play more Fighting Fury Belts than pretty much every deck plays Field Blowers, so ideally we can get to a stage where our opponent can't, Field Blow up our last Fighting Fury Belt, and we might be able to let a Hoopa live for a turn extra than it would have otherwise. The 10 extra damage that it does is also very crucial. It allows us to 2-hit KO like certain Pokemon, say for instance Greninja Break, Baby Volcanions with Fighting Fury Belts, certain GXs like Tapu Lele, and things like that. Allows us to KO, say, Octillery. There's lots and lots of different cards that extra 10 damage makes a difference for, because ultimately we're about KOing the non-X GX Pokemon. We're not just interested in doing lots of damage with Choice Band. Yeah, so this is pretty much a no-brainer playing 4 Fighting Fury Belt. And we have 3 Floatstone. Again, alluded to that earlier, but it's important that we're able to retreat to our Orangurus, Giratinas, and even Hoopa. And it's not bad to attach it to Hoopa sometimes. Yeah, crucial to be able to use Guzma and promote something so that we can Max Elixir to the bench, so that we can attack with something that didn't have all the energy on it already. You could play more than this. I wouldn't play less. You might be able to get away with 2, but I think 3 is a pretty solid number. Yeah, I wouldn't go less or more. Now for some of the more interesting cards, I guess. So we have 2 Enhanced Hammer. This is good against a few matchups, so it's helpful against Zoroark builds, particularly the ones that are more competitive against us, that play certain cards that can attack us, which I'll get to later when we get to the matchups. But yeah, so Enhanced Hammer is good against those. It's good against Garbodor decks, which are more tricky matchups. It's good against those. And it's just a general utility card. You never know when it's going to help out, obviously in the matchups that play Special Energy, but it can be really helpful. And it's not a supporter, it's just a burnable card, so yeah, it's not going to help all your matchups for obvious reasons, but I think it's worthy of 2. It's not an essential card in the deck by any means, because of course, we're not a disruption deck, but it can certainly help out. For the stadiums, so we play 1 Reverse Valley, which is good to just get 10 extra damage. This allows us to do 90 damage without Fighting Fury Belt, and it allows us to do 100 damage with Fighting Fury Belt, so this can KO Mind Jack Zoroark in particular, and can also allow us to 2-hit KO 190 HP GXs, which isn't the most important thing, but it can be helpful in just putting pressure on an opponent if they're stalling us with the Buzzwole GX while they're powering stuff up on the bench, and if you can't find a Guzma, you might want to be able to 2-hit KO the Buzzwole. Things like that. It's not super critical, but being able to do 10 extra damage can come in handy in certain matchups, the way the numbers work out. Also have 1 Parallel City. This is a card that has general utility. It's mostly attack against Volcanion though. Restricting them to 3 bench can be really potent, because a Baby Volk needs 2 Steam Ups with the Steam Artillery to 1-hit KO Fighting Fury Belted Hoopa, and if you can, by restricting them to the 3 bench, you can make it kind of awkward for them. You can force them to have like only 1 Baby Volk on the bench, or get rid of an Oranguru, which is also a good attacker, and just kind of like make it awkward for them. Alternatively, depending on their setup, you could even flip it the other way and reduce the damage by 20. Say if they filled up their bench completely, but they only have 2 Steam Up Volcanions. what can happen is that if they can't Fighting Fury Belt you, if they can't hit Field Blow your Fighting Fury Belt in Parallel City, because they max out at 160 or 170 with a Fighting Fury Belt damage, they actually can't knock out a Hoopa with a Fighting Fury Belt, because their bench is full, so they can't put down any more Steam Up Volcanians, and the most they can do is, well, after the -20, the most they can do is 150. So either side can be useful against Volcanion. You'll have to use your judgment as to which side is best for that situation, but it can help us in a matchup that can be difficult. I'll get to it later, but it depends on the list that people are playing, depends on the type of Volk list that they're playing. But yeah, it has general utility. It can always be good restricting your opponent to 3 bench. So, although typically, because of course your opponent's only going to have so many good attackers against you, typically it's not the most impactful thing, but it can have a niche usage elsewhere. But it's definitely worth playing for Volcanion, I think. And if you're worried about Volcanion, you could play even more Parallel City if you wanted. So that's pretty much all of the list, really. Yeah, you could change up the counts of certain cards, but I think it's a relatively streamlined and relatively straightforward list. It aims to be consistent and just set up all the time and do what it's built to do. Yeah, so I think let's just get into its matchups. So I think the first matchup to address in this format is certainly Zoroark. Obviously, it's a very popular deck. So really broken down into 2-man decks. So Zoroark Lycanroc and Zoroark Lizardpod. Zoroark Lycanroc is typically strongly favoured because the only cards that they can use to KO Hoopa are Rockruff, generally speaking. And Rockruff requires 2 strong energy with its second attack to KO Hoopa. And once you KO it, it's very difficult for them to set up another one. And then if they're building one on the bench, you can Guzma it. You can even enhance how many strong energies that are sitting there. They're just not a particularly threatening deck. They can KO with 1 strong energy and another energy with, say, like a Kukui, but just the fact that they need to manually attach 2 energy and that they have no energy acceleration is just very difficult for them. And so it's a strongly favoured matchup. Some lists play Mewtwo, which is actually a good attacker against Hoopa. I'll get to its role in Zoroark Lizardpod, but some do play Mewtwo, and which is of course useless against the stall builds of Hoopa because they don't really play any energy. But against this, Mewtwo's Psychic 2 at KOs a Hoopa with 3 energy. So Psychic will do 80 minus the 20 from resistance. So if they can get rid of a Fighting Fury Belt with Field Blower, they can get a 2 at KO on Hoopa. So look, Mewtwo can make the matchup a bit more of a pain, but typically Zoroark Lycanroc decks don't have as much of a focus on healing as the Lizardpod versions, so they're not going to play Max Potion. They play a lower Acerola count, usually 1 or 2. Mewtwo's only really an issue if they're healing over and over and over and over and over again, because otherwise it's just a trade, 2-hit trade each way, and it's not really going to swing the matchup much. And if they have to Acerola, that means they're attaching the DC back again to Mewtwo. They can't use that turn to attach to a Rockruff and set it up for a 1 at KO, so pretty much no matter what they play, unless they play what's called Baby Lycanroc, which I'll get to when we get to Buzzwole Lycanroc, because it was a more popular deck in that deck, although I did see some Zoroark Lycanroc decks actually play the Baby Lycanroc. So what that card does, it has 110 HP, which is just out of range. Hoopa can't want to KO that under any circumstances. And for 1 fighting energy, it essentially does 120 damage to Hoopa. So, and that's without strong energy. So basically, that card in Zoroark Lycanroc, you almost can't beat the deck if it plays that, because they've got Rescue Stretcher and Full Puzzle of Time. So, once they get 1 out, they're pretty much going to steamroll you, and once you eventually do knock it out, if you can't even do that, they're just going to get more and more and more and more. So, look, generally the matchup's favourable, unless they happen to play the Baby Lycanroc. That's a theme that we'll get to when we get to Buzzrock, but it's certainly true. It's certainly true in Zoroark Lycanroc. So onto Zoroark Lizardpod. So what makes it different for them? I think it's similar. The thing is that they tend to play different non-XGX attackers. So they've got typically Tapu Koko. They pretty much always play Mindjack Zoroark, whereas most Zoroark Lycanroc decks don't play Mindjack. It's not a hugely impactful card, generally speaking, but it can be a useful attacker. It's pretty much never getting 1 at KO, but it can get 2 at KOs on you, which can pose problems, particularly if you can't draw a reverse value to 1 at KO it, but it's not the end of the world generally. But Golisopod decks, look, if they just play, it depends on what card they play as their Buzzwole counter. So I mentioned Mewtwo. If they choose to play Mew EX, which was getting more popular recently, and I think most of the Zoroark Golisopod decks that I saw were playing Mew EX over Mewtwo. If they play Mew EX, the matchup is almost an auto win, because the only attackers they can use to hit you are Tapu Koko and Mindjack Zoroark. And both of those rely on you benching cards on your bench. and if you just attack with a single Hoopa, well, the maximum damage they can do to you is 20 damage. So you just wait until your Hoopa's close to getting KO'd, and then you bench another one. But you only bench it right as it's about to get KO'd. To be safe, don't bench something else when it gets to 80 damage, because there is the chance that they play Professor Kukui. That's something that I've seen some lists play. It's pretty rare, but they can play it. There'd be nothing worse than getting benched out with a Flying Flip for 40 damage and a Field Blower and a Fighting Fury Belt because you didn't bench any more Hoopas in a matchup that's really favourable for you. So there definitely is that consideration. It can also get a bit awkward when you don't know whether they play Mewtwo or not. So I think firstly to get into why Mewtwo's good in this matchup, so obviously they're going to be 2-KOing you. But unlike Zoroark, Lycanroc, they play a much heavy healing focus. So with 3 Acerola, typically say 1 Max Potion, 4 Puzzle of Time, they've got a lot of ways they can heal Mewtwo, because Mewtwo has 130 HP, you can't one-hit KO it. So they can essentially grind you by just healing it over and over again. And they can actually just win in a straight-up fight if they get all of their healing cards going. This is where Enhanced Hammer can be useful, in terms of just running them out of resources. If you can Enhanced Hammer a few DCEs on Mewtwo, and say force them to Puzzle of Time for a DCE, instead of Puzzle of Timing for, you know, an Acerola or a Max Potion or something like that, you know, you can win that kind of protracted trade war. Acerola is also very good for us in those kind of, in that back and forth. So the matchup becomes absolutely winnable for Zoroark at this spot if they do play Mewtwo. Where it gets a bit tricky is when you don't know whether they play Mewtwo or not, in terms of how you play it, because you're not sure often how many Pokemon to bench, because you don't want to just go, and so I think typically assume that they play Mewtwo, unless you're pretty sure that they don't, unless you're almost certain that they don't play Mewtwo, because again, there's nothing worse than you know, them just dropping a surprise Mewtwo and benching you out when you were not benching Pokemon just to not take damage from Tapu Koko and Zoroark. So that can, and that's something you have to use your judgment on. I was typically conservative when I played that, so yeah, even after the game when I found out, yep, my suspicions were confirmed, you know, they didn't play Mewtwo, you know, but I was wary of not benching anything and just worried about being benched out. Because also keep in mind that just because your opponent didn't say Bridget for Mewtwo turn 1, that doesn't mean they don't have it in their deck, because they might not have realised what deck you're playing. They might have seen a Hooper and they're like, oh, well, Mewtwo's not going to help me because they're not going to play any energy, because I think that they're just a regular Storm Hooper deck, so I'm not going to get out Mewtwo. And so just because they don't search for Mewtwo, say on turn 1, if they get like a Bridget, that doesn't mean they don't play it. So there is that kind of tricky meta sort of calculation of like, okay, how do I play this matchup? But look, generally speaking, it's extremely favourable if they don't play Mewtwo. I'd say it's still favourable even if they do, but you can certainly lose it. And it's something you've got to play intelligently, and it's where your tech Enhanced Hammers and Ace Rolls are really going to come in handy. But yeah, I'd say that it's, and even if they do play Mewtwo, they've got no cards that can really apply pressure to you, because Mewtwo can only deal with a fully powered Hoopa. So it's a pretty forgiving matchup in the sense that all their attackers rely on you putting down bench Pokemon or attaching energy. So that's it for the Zoroark variants. That covers quite a lot of the field, really, at tournaments in this format. And so the next one's Boswell Lycanroc. So Boswell Lycanroc, I think, has a similar story to Zoroark Lycanroc in the sense that it's strongly favourable unless they play that Baby Lycanroc, which quite a few lists were doing. I played against quite a few decks that played Baby Lycanroc, and it's a tough matchup because of Baby Lycanroc's HP and the fact that it can get a 1 KO for 1 energy, essentially. And yeah, so look, I think, yeah, it is very favourable if they don't play Baby Lycanroc, because it's the same story of you KO the Rockruffs. They have Sudowoodo, but Sudowoodo can't run through. It can get a return KO on you, but it's not going to put on any pressure after that, obviously, because they can only watch and learn after you've attacked. So you've always got time to set up, and they don't have the best recovery, so like, well, they'll only play 2 Rockruffs generally, so you just need to get a few knockouts, and you know, generally, you know, that's pretty much the game. So often they can't even get 1 KOs with Rockruff, so they generally list play like 1 Field Blower. I've never seen a list that plays more than that, and I've seen some list cut Field Blower entirely. So if they can't get rid of Fighting Fury Belt, they're basically just never going to KO in 1 hit with the Rockruff. Of course, I'm talking about the promo Rockruff when I'm talking about Rockruff. And yeah, so the matchup's strongly favourable. Baby Lycanroc, as I've talked about earlier, is a serious problem. You can win games, but because it's generally going to be getting 1 KOs, the only way you can survive is if you have a Fighting Fury Belt and they don't hit a Strong Energy or a Field Blower, which is quite a lot to ask for. But you know, even if you can say Enhanced Hammer a Strong Energy here or there, or you know, Guzmacow or Rockruff that had a Strong Energy on the bench, you know, there's a chance that they'll whiff and that they can't get a 1 KO on you. So but generally speaking, oh, whoops, we have lost connection with the server. Just bear with us. Yeah, so look, generally speaking, it's strongly unfavourable if they do play it. You can use Tapu Koko to set up multiple Rock Crufts with 20 damage, so then Lycanroc will only have 90 HP left, and then you can KO it with a Super Psybolt. The problem with that is that you're giving your opponent a free prize by playing Tapu Koko, and you know, often it's still not enough, but it can be the right play. But you have to exercise your judgment when using these non-Hoopa attackers in these matchups, because it can give your opponent a free prize with a Buzzwole, for instance. So, of course, a Buzzwole Lycanroc deck, a Baby Lycanroc could one-hit KO all of your Pokemon regardless, so they could KO a Hoopa or a Tapu Koko just the same. But if you spread with a Tapu Koko, they're not obliged to attack you with Baby Lycanroc so that you can follow up with a Super Psybolt. They can just knock you out with Buzzwole. So then you have to find a Guzma to carry the Baby Lycanroc on the bench, and sometimes the trades aren't as favourable as you might think. So, look, I think that's the play sometimes in the matchup, but and also if they only bench one Rockruff at a time, it's obviously not going to really do that much. But yeah, that's a tough matchup. Gardevoir Zoroark, or just any Gardevoir variant, is strongly unfavourable. So Gallade's extremely hard to deal with because they have, well, for a few reasons. One, Gallade, it's the standard story of it one-hit KOs you, but you can't one-hit KO it. And to make matters even worse, they can abuse Max Potion pretty well. So once they set up, you know, they can Max Potion a Gallade a few times, and even if you do knock it out, they'll be able to Twilight it back with Gardevoir or Super Rod it back, and you can't really apply pressure to the deck very well because Gardevoir is such a good stalling card against you. So I was talking before how, you know, a lot of attacks that you do will be irrelevant with this deck, and there's no matchup that illustrates that better than Gardevoir. With 230 HP and Dark Resistance, you will, at absolute best, you can 3-hit KO it, but generally speaking, you won't even be able to do that. And of course, they have Max Potion, and it's just, yeah, it's pretty bad. So look, you can win this matchup, but it's very difficult. You need to be able to Guzma up, you know, Rolts and, well, Kelly's if they play it, but the Zoroark Gardevoir deck didn't, but or even Gallades that are out but didn't have the energy on them, and just hit them and hope that they aren't able to Max Potion and then knock them out, and then just apply enough pressure to kind of close out a game. But it is very difficult. It's a very difficult matchup to win. Yeah, it's definitely a deck that you want to avoid. Moving on to Vikabulu. So I'd say Vikabulu is quite a close matchup. It's, I think, the closest matchup this deck has to 50-50. And that's because they have some good attackers against you, but you definitely have ways to beat them. So typically their good attackers will be Vikavolt themselves and Oranguru. That's mainly what they have against you. And also Mew copying Tapu Bulu's attack. So really they've got 3 different attackers. But what can be difficult for them? And it might seem intuitively like, well, surely that means they win the matchup because, you know, they've got good attackers against you and you can't one-hit KO those except for Mew. But they're not a deck that's really built to attack over and over again to take single prizes. And they're definitely not a deck that's built to actually attack with Vikavolt that much. So what I mean by that is, if every time they attack with Vikavolt, they're discarding 3 energy. So, and often if you've got a Fighting Fury Belt, they're not even going to be getting a one-hit knockout with that. So their resources get quite strained against you, and you can kind of grind them out in a lot of cases. And okay, Mew one-hit KOs you by copying Bulu's attack, but then you can just one-shot it right back. You can one-shot Oranguru's with your own Oranguru, or you can attack with Hoopa and hope that they can't Field Blow or Fighting Fury Belt. Fighting Fury Belt and Acerola in this matchup are just the key things. I'd say that the way it trades, it's approximately 50-50. It's neither a very favourable matchup, but it's neither particularly unfavourable. Also, lists tend to have trouble getting out multiple Vikavolts, because that's not something that they need to do in a lot of matchups. You know, just kind of one sits there on the bench and, you know, they can get out another one if they need, but typically they're not under any real pressure to get up like 2 super fast. But in this matchup, they need to get up multiple, because they're going to have to attack with it at some stage. And if they're playing like a 3-0-3 line, as many are, it can be quite awkward for them to get up multiple. And if you start KOing Vikavolts, then, you know, they're not always going to have the cards that they need. So I'd say it's quite even. Volk depends on what build it is. So if they're the regular Volk build with like all the power hitter Volcanions, they're unfavourable. Not unwinnable, but they are unfavourable because they do have good attacker against you. And also some play Oranguru, which is a good attacker as well, although they do play a lower Field Blow account, so they can't always Field Blow your Fighting Fury Belt to get a knockout with Psychic. But yeah, typically that's unfavourable. Of course, Parallel City does come in clutch, And with Acerola healing some of your Pokemon, you can sometimes grind them out, and it depends on how many Baby Volk they play. If they play 4, it's generally pretty tough to win, but you know, most lists don't play 4, even if those builds, you know, they might play like 3, sometimes even 2, but if they play 3, sometimes they might not be able to hit the Super Rod when they need, and you can just kind of grind them out of attackers, even though Volk is a better attacker against you than Hoopa is against it. Just the fact that you have more Hoopa, the fact that you might be able to Acerola at some point, the fact that you're fighting Fury Belt and Parallel City means that you can compete. They also play Enhanced Hammer, so sometimes that's a bit of a pain, but it's winnable. The Kiawe version of Volcanion, I'd say, is quite strongly favourable because they don't really play as many, if any, in some lists, Baby Volk. Typically, they'll play, something like Mew, but of course that just gets 1-hit KO'd by Super Cybolt, so look, I'd say that that's pretty solidly favourable. They just don't have the attackers to keep up with you, and yeah, I think it's a matchup that you want to face for sure. Just rounding out the matchup, so Greninja, I think we touched on with Giratina, but with Giratina, this is a pretty solidly favourable matchup. Essentially, you're trading 2 KOs back and forth, because of course you can deal 90 damage most of the time, and you just need to deal 90 and 80. And you also have Acerola, which you can use to swing the prize trade more favourably for you. But also, Greninja's a slow deck, so typically you'll get 1 or 2 prizes ahead, depending on whether you go first or second, before they're able to attack you. So generally speaking, you're going to be trading 2 KOs over and over again, but you'll get the early lead, and there's not really anything they can do about that. And you can abuse Acerola, and also you can get cheap prizes with Guzma. That's one way that you can get ahead in the matchup as well. Although you do need to be careful that sometimes using Guzma might seem like a free prize, but actually it might allow them to rotate between Greninjas and effectively make you waste an attack. So what I mean is, so this is I think a good hypothetical scenario, although I mean this happened to be when I've played online. Say you're playing against, you know, the numbers don't have to be exactly like this, but let's just say you're playing against Greninja, and you've got 3 prizes left, you've got 1 Guzma left, and they've got 3 Greninja breaks left. And they've just got like 1 easy Pokemon to carry on the bench that you can Guzma, maybe like a Starmie or a Froakie or something like that. You might think that, oh, well, I can play my last Guzma and I can get a cheap prize in that, and then I just need 2 more prizes. So that Guzma's help me take a 1-hit KO instead of a 2-hit KO, which I would normally be taking. Therefore, that must help me. But actually, that's not actually the case, because if you think about it, let's just say you were to take that Guzma KO on that cheap Pokemon. Then you'd still need to attack the Greninjas 5 times to get 2 knockouts, because what they do is when you hit Greninja number 1, they retreat it to the bench. Then you hit Greninja number 2, they retreat that to the bench. Then you hit Greninja number 3, then all of them would have damage, so then you'd need to attack twice more to take 2 more knockouts. So you'd need to attack the Greninjas 5 times after you've attacked the cheap Pokemon once with Guzma. So you'd need to use 6 overall attacks to take 3 prizes, for instance. Versus if you didn't use the Guzma and you just attacked all of the Greninja breaks twice, that would still be 6 attacks, taking 6 prizes. So sometimes, because they have the ability to switch between Greninjas, because of course they have free retreat and you can't 1-hit KO them, sometimes going lower in prizes than they have Greninjas doesn't actually help you win the game any faster. That's something that I realized when I played the deck a few times. So that situation comes up with different numbers, often in that matchup. That's not a concept that's too relevant in other matchups, but yeah, that's something that is relevant in that matchup. But definitely favourable. They can potentially swing the trade in their favour if they get sort of a lucky enhanced hammer with an N and maybe a shadow stitching, but it's hard for them to actually use shadow stitching because they can't use it every turn if they still want to get a 2-hit KO. So, and typically, yeah, it's very hard for them to make a comeback, essentially. Okay, so rounding it out, so we've got Garb variants, which was touched on earlier. So I think Buzzwole Garb is unfavourable, but you can make it winnable with Tapu Koko and being able to, once you get rid of the Garbs, generally speaking, you're in a very, very good position. Now, I think some of the lists play like Carbink Break. Those are going to be very, very difficult to deal with because even once you carry the Garbs, you're still not safe. Yeah, but I think the average list, to the extent that Carbink is not in the average list, I'm not sure what people are doing nowadays exactly, but yeah, I think it's generally unfavourable. Gliscod Garbodor is, I think, quite a bit easier because they don't put on as much pressure and they don't play as many, say, Field Blower. So even when they have Garb in play, they're not going to be putting on too much pressure because Gliscod can't 1-hit KO a Hoopa with a Fighting Fury Belt, and they also don't really play Trash Launch Garbodor, usually. The days of people playing Rainbow Energy and Trash Launch in that deck are kind of over, I think. The second place Memphis regionals list, didn't play that. Just played Basic Energy and Garbotoxin. So look, I think that's a lot more favourable because just all you need to do is get rid of the Garbotoxin Garbodor, and then they don't have a whole lot. I mean, they can attack with like Mewtwo and Tapu Koko, but they don't play as many Acerola, and I think you can close out a game, as long as they weren't able to take too many prizes before you could eliminate Garbodor. But yeah, so I think the Garb matchups are close-ish, but I'd say Buzzwole Garb is unfavourable but still winnable, and Gliscod Garb I think is probably favourable, I would say, although that's the less popular variant now. So what about Mill? Well, Mill depends on the Mill deck specifically. So Sylveon's a very bad matchup. I managed to win my first round against one, but it's pretty poor just because you're like generally, I mean, the best you can do is 3-KO them, and they can just loop Lucamines and Acerolas over and over again. So really get to a stage where like you literally cannot win in a lot of ways. You need to put a lot of pressure early to the extent that you can do that, which is not very well, but and just like end them a few times and just hope to kind of slow dunk them. That's what I managed to do in my first round against Sylveon. And if you can sort of take game one, I mean, often games, and this is a problem I have with Mill in general, and this is actually an advantage that this deck has over like other against sort of Hoopa Mill decks. They have a similar matchup spread, but an advantage this has over the Mill decks is that you can sort of, well, the problem with Mill decks is that if they lose game one, they'll really struggle to win in time in a best of 3 match play scenario, because winning for them takes so long if you just don't play any cards down it and you don't help them win faster. So often, you might only need to win one game in a best of 3 series against a Sylveon to actually close it out. That's what actually happened to me. So the second game didn't finish and managed to win the series. But Sylveon's the long and short of it is it's a terrible matchup. The Hoopa Wob deck I think is actually favourable because they can't loop Lucamine and Acerola in the same way. So when I say the loop, what I mean is Lucamining for Lucamine and Acerola. And so if you can't 2-KO something, they can just do that over and over again. And there's only so many times you can end them and hope they don't draw it. But against Hoopa Wob, you are 2-KOing everything in their deck. So they can't really do it in the same way. And this is a deck that doesn't get run out of energy particularly easily because we play so many, and we play 2 Super and we play a Special Charge. So, and another card that's helpful in this matchup is actually Tapu Koko. It's something that we can send active while we power up one Hoopa, so we don't want to put anything else down on a bench because they'll be counter catcher or Guzma targets. So we'll have just one Tapu Koko in play ideally, and one Hoopa. And we'll stick the Tapu Koko active until we've powered up the Hoopa on the bench so that we don't get team Flagranted. Because potentially we could just get Flagranted and Crushing Hammered over and over again and have a Hoopa that's stuck in the active that can't do anything. So we want to send up a Tapu Koko with the free retreat to just to sit there and not do anything, but until we can power up Hoopa with enough energy to the point where we can say, okay, I can survive a few team Flagrants and Crushing Hammers. I can just Super Cyber over and over and over and over and over again. I can win the game. So I think that this is a favourable matchup. Yeah, I think that it is. What's become less popular now is the Wishy-Washy Xurkitree Hoopa deck, the one that sort of premiered, I think it was Memphis Regionals. That I think is in a similar boat to Sylveon in the sense that because you can't 2-KO Wishy-Washy, they can loop Lucamine and Acerola over and over again. What makes this matchup a bit better is that they don't have the consistency of Sylveon, whereas if you end Sylveon, they can just a Magical Ribbon again. So you really need to do that multiple times in a row, which is really difficult to do. You've only got a certain amount of N. Whereas, you can really you can mess up the Wishy-Washy Xurkitree Hoopa deck, and sometimes they just don't draw what they need. So you can catch them in turns where they don't draw that, and if you just get a few KOs and a few cheap ones, and you can win a game. There is also a way of actually getting around this is quite obscure, but hopefully this makes sense. With Tapu Koko's Flying Flip, you can, because to knock out 2 Wishy-Washys, you essentially need 6 attacks. With Tapu Koko, you can make it so that you only need 5. If you Flying Flip 2 Wishy-Washys, you can essentially, that damage can go towards the 3-KO with Hoopa, but it also sets up the bench one for meaning you only need to hit it with, let me start that over again, means that each Wishy-Washy only needs 2 attacks with Hoopa. So if you can just do 190 damage, so attacking with a Fighting Fury Belt and a Reverse Valley at least once, you can essentially, you can make it so that there's a turn where they can't Lucamine Acerola. If you've ever played the matchup, you'll know what I'm talking about. But anyway, that's a niche play that often you won't be able to get up and running, but that's one way you can kind of break that infinite lock. Aside from that, often you can tell, you can tell when you're licked. You can tell when there's not much you can do. So, yeah, so I'd say that's an unfavourable matchup. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much all the matchups. I think it has a similar matchup spread to the mill decks, but crucially, you have, I think, very much a fighting chance against Volk. You know, definitely Vikabulu, Greninja, those sort of matchups, and you can actually put pressure on in a time format. So I think that's really the advantage it has over those mill decks, essentially. So what could you put into the list instead of this? Well, what are some cards you can put in? Well, you could put in, say, as I mentioned before, like a 10th Dark, you know, just to make Max Elixir more consistent. You don't really need that many Dark purely for the basis of attacking, but Max Elixir is such an important card in the deck that, you know, that could warrant an inclusion. I did start out the list that way, but I had to cut. I was playing one Rescue Stretcher and one Super Rod, and I cut the Rescue Stretcher for another Super Rod and then took out a Dark. You could reverse that. If you were to play 10 Dark, I would play a Rescue Stretcher over the second Super Rod. You know, being able to get Hoopa straight back to your hand can be really helpful. And, you know, you don't need that much energy recovery if you play 10 Dark. You could play more Reverse Valley, or even if you wanted to play that many damage-adding stadiums, you could consider a Devoured Field, because it would allow you to, you know, if you wanted to play as I did originally, say 3 damage-adding stadiums, you'd want to play, say, like 2 Reverse Valley and 1 Devoured Field. They both had 10 damage to Dark Pokemon, but playing different stadiums would allow you to like counter your own stadium, so you can draw more from Guru or Lily if you needed. It also means you can counter your opponent's Reverse Valley so that you can get the 10 damage buff to KO Mindjack Zoroark. That's a pretty obscure situation because most Zoroark decks don't play Reverse Valley, but that could come up. We're dealing about pretty small effects here. It doesn't matter too much what you play, but that's something you can put in the deck. I mean, I don't think that it's super necessary. It can help against the Garb matchup in terms of being able to, say, KO Garbotoxin without spreading with Tapu Koko, and obviously it helps against Mindjack Zoroark. Although that's, again, not a huge issue, I think, also because Mindjack Zoroark's a hard card from Acerola because they need a Zoro on the bench. Otherwise, they'll just sort of have to pass or attack with something else for a turn. Yeah, the only other card I would consider putting this is potentially Mew from Fate's Collide, so the one that would allow you to copper Hoopa's attack. This would give you a Psychic attacker that can one-hit KO Gallade. That is a possibility. I reasoned that that wouldn't help the matchup enough because it's just going to get return KO'd by a Guardi, and then, you know, then you just have Guardi to deal with, and then they can just spend ages just setting up over and over again. And with this deck, you don't want to give your opponent non-Hoopa prizes because it means that they'll only need to KO a few Hoopas. So if you're giving your opponent, you know, a free Mew prize, it just makes them that much closer to winning. I think it would be marginally helpful in that Gardevoir matchup, but I reasoned that it wasn't worth trying to help that matchup by adding a card that would lessen your consistency in other matchups. And 50 HP basic with Psychic weakness is very, very dangerous to start with. You know, if you start with it and you don't draw any, you know, Nest Balls or Ultra Balls or Basics on your first turn, you know, you can be in a lot of strife. You know, I've won plenty of games where I've started out with just a basic and not much else for a bit, but I've managed to survive just because the basics were beefy enough. So Hoopa's obviously, you know, quite sturdy because of the ability. But even, you know, sometimes you might start with Giratina and you might not get a basic till the second turn or something like that. But, you know, because Giratina's got 130 HP, it can survive. But, you know, Mew on the other hand, you really are running a risk of hurting your other matchups when you play it. It does have Free Retreat, which is nice, but, you know, I didn't warrant it. I didn't think that it warranted inclusion. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. Sort of, I guess going forward, you know, what does the meta hold for this deck? Well, you know, I think it depends on what's favorable in the next set, what people like. This certainly gets absolutely destroyed by, you know, things like Garchomp Lucario and Empoleon and all this kind of stuff. But look, it depends on what's popular. I don't think those two decks will necessarily be powerhouses or anything. I think it's definitely competing against Magnezone decks. But yeah, this is a very metagame conscious deck. You've got to be very careful what people are playing because, you know, its matchup spread's pretty volatile. But yeah, look, it's something that I think you should always keep in mind and go, okay, could I play this deck? You know, is the metagame right for this sort of deck? And yeah, it's a deck that I think, you know, you can succeed with if you make the right call on that. And yeah, thanks for watching, and hopefully this, you know, clears up some of the mystique around the deck. And yeah, hopefully that was helpful. And have a good one.